Hello, my name is Dave and welcome to a very special episode of Zilog and Moto. I mean, they're all special, but this is one of those slots on the calendar that's been circled for a while, like when the South Carolina Gamecocks are getting ready to play the Clemson Tigers in college football. And if you're watching this video from outside the southeastern United States, just pretend you get the reference. It will make things easier. This week, I'm discussing a game that, and I don't think this is a lie or blowing things out of proportion, that changed my life, or at least the direction of it, and now we're seeing the results of that 30 years later with this channel that you're watching right now. If you're familiar with the channel, welcome back, but if you're new to things, you might be wondering what just you've gotten yourself into here. Totally understandable. Well, as you can see behind me, I've got a lot of Sega games. Some here, some over there, they're all over the place. There's a reason for this. About 3.5 years ago, after watching other people on YouTube with large collections, seemingly primarily on Nintendo platforms, I wanted to do something similar. Now, there's nothing wrong with Nintendo, but as far as YouTube and popular culture is concerned, it's been done before. There's plenty of other people that are certainly of much higher profile than me that have already covered those games, and probably better than I could have. Sega, on the other hand, was my platform of choice. I'd always loved that via one base console in the Genesis, and some additional hardware depending on the game, you could play Genesis games, you could play Sega CD games, you could play 32X games, and hell, you could even play Master System games because Sega was smart enough to design the Genesis with essentially Master System hardware built directly into the console motherboard. The fact that this crazy Voltron of technology existed made me want to collect all the games that could be played on it, or at least that I can play since I can't read Japanese, and then showcase each and every one of them, good and bad. And that's what I've been doing. Once every week or so, picking a game off the shelf, going through it inside and out, and then sharing that experience with all of you. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in seeing going forward, think about subscribing, as it will help you know when I get a new video out, and it will also help other people possibly know these videos exist, and give these games one more day in the sun. Okay, now that all that is out of the way, let's get into the game that's got me all worked up and excited, and that is Streets of Rage for the Genesis. Streets of Rage was released in September of 1991 in the United States, about a month after it was previously released in Japan, with a slightly different name in Bare Knuckle. Personally, I go back and forth as to whether I prefer the name Bare Knuckle or Streets of Rage. I think this is one of those rare cases where they're both fantastic, and Sega simply could just do no wrong with this game, no matter what they called it. If you're not familiar with Streets of Rage, I'm going to assume you're younger, as sadly it had been a dormant franchise for about 25 years until the release of Streets of Rage 4 in 2020. As you could probably tell from the name Streets of Rage or Bare Knuckle, it's a side-scrolling beat-em-up which was hugely popular in the arcades at the time. And you wouldn't be wrong to call it Sega's take on Final Fight, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But what is it about Streets of Rage that makes it special? And does it hold up when played today, with so much having changed in the last 30 years? I'll take a look at all that and more, but first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Streets of Rage. While I remember when I bought certain games in the collection, this isn't one of those, and I think that's probably because this was more than likely one of the first games I picked up when I started collecting as an adult, due to how much I'd liked it as a kid. In fact, now that I think about it, I'm pretty certain I grabbed this one off of eBay just because I didn't want to mess around looking for it. I just wanted it in my collection right away. Also, I wanted to specifically make sure that I got this, the original version, as opposed to the classic re-release, just because the original version was the one that I grew up with, and let's be honest, the re-release versions of games for any console pretty much just don't look as good as the originals. But that's especially the case with the Genesis titles, where not only is the outside subpar, but they also come with the crappy Xeroxed manuals as well. This copy is in pretty great condition, as this game and its sequel are definitely two titles that I wasn't going to cheap out on. The hang tab is intact at the top, and the outer plastic cover is held up well, with no scratches, scuffs, or rips. And the inner cover is minty fresh as well, looking just like it's supposed to, with no water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear at the top or bottom. As far as the cover art goes, this is one of those covers that's iconic on the console, although not necessarily for the right reasons. If you just look at the art on its own, it's great. Sells the image of good guys brawling with random enemies, while the city is literally on fire and the police appeared powerless to do anything. And I like how the bad guys appear slightly out of frame, giving the art a bit of a 3D appearance, like the action is coming right at you. However, fans of the game will also know that this is definitely one of those cases where they had the artist come up with the picture without really actually having seen the game, or at least only based on a very early version, as Axel is wearing a yellow shirt instead of a white one, Blaze is wearing a white outfit with pants, and Adam is nowhere to be seen. While I do like the US cover, even with its flaws, this leads to yet another instance where Japan got a better cover than the US did. Just take a look. Great logo at the top, and art that is clearly more representative of the game. But then also, check out the back. Look at these great widescreen composited shots at the top, and tons of screenshots down at the bottom. I've seriously considered buying this version just to have it sitting on the shelf. The Genesis rear cover isn't nearly as exciting, but it's fine. 3 screenshots showing off each of the characters in different levels, and then minimal flavor text. But what is there gets the point across. Also, you may have noticed that not only on the front, but also at the top of the back, and even larger than usual at the bottom, 2-player action is emphasized. More on why they did that in a minute. Opening the case up, and the cartridge and manual has seen some wear, but they've both been taken care of. The manual starts out with the backstory of the game as you would expect, and then goes over gameplay with a lengthy section detailing the different moves that each character can pull off, along with plenty of screenshots. Then there's also nice info about the various items and weapons that can be picked up before going over each of the levels in the game, except for the last one, with just a tease that you'll have to see the Syndicate headquarters to find out what's going on there. Finally, a traditional high score table at the end, but I like how they added success, as if the players are going to admit that they failed to beat the game. Okay, that's the package. Let's bust some heads. To talk about Streets of Rage and really get the full picture, you have to discuss where gaming was at the time, especially in the arcades. I've discussed this in previous reviews, but as a young child, one of my favorite arcade games was Double Dragon 2, as they had it in the skating rink that I would go to during the summers between school. I loved the beat-em-up style of gameplay, all the different attacks, the weapons, and the enemies that would change the further you got into the game. Eventually, I'd find other classics from that era, the original Double Dragon, Ninja Gaiden, Vigilante, etc., and they were all good in their own ways. But then I found the arcade beat-em-up, Final Fight. I put so much money into Final Fight over the years, I'm pretty certain I beat it in the arcades at least twice, not to mention all the times that I just walked up to it and saw how far I could get on $1. If you haven't played the original Final Fight, you really should go do that now. It's available in a variety of forms on modern consoles, so you don't have to go the emulation route if you don't want to. Final Fight was just the perfect beat-em-up for the time. Huge, colorful characters, a great soundtrack, not that you could hear it in the arcades, and 6 multi-segmented levels of action to be explored with 3 characters that fought different styles, and of course it was 2-player. Sega of course wanted Final Fight, which was an arcade juggernaut for the Genesis. Unfortunately, there was a few problems with this. The first of which was that Final Fight developer and publisher Capcom's current relationship with Nintendo. Capcom at the time was exclusive to Nintendo due to contractual shenanigans, and could only release games for Nintendo consoles. And before you ask, well, what about games like Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, and Mercs? Well, those games were actually reprogrammed from the ground up by Sega, with the content just licensed from Capcom. In the case of Final Fight, Nintendo got exclusive rights to the game from Capcom, at least temporarily, and ended up with 2 different Super Nintendo releases. Final Fight, a port of the arcade game with characters Hagar and Cody, and then much later Final Fight Guy, a Blockbuster rental exclusive that swapped out Cody for Guy. The fact that the game had 2 releases and neither had all 3 characters was just one of a few issues with the port to the Super Nintendo, which also suffered from Nintendo's traditional censorship at the time, and more importantly, only supported 1 player, a necessary limitation to support having a decent amount of enemies on the screen at one time. While all this was occurring, Sega knew that they needed to make their own play. Games like Golden Axe and Alien Storm are great, but they didn't quite scratch that itch of players wanting to beat up gangs of thugs in the inner city. Enter Streets of Rage in September of 1991, hitting the market just before the American version of Final Fight on the Super Nintendo in November of that year. To be clear, I don't want viewers of this video to think that I think Streets of Rage is merely a Final Fight clone. Sure, they have similar content and plots, and they're both beat-em-ups designed to compete with one another on the home market, but Sega didn't rip off Final Fight to create Streets of Rage. Having said that, let's go over some of the differences between the two games. The first thing to mention is what I referred to previously on the cover in Streets of Rage's own emphasis on two-player action. While it's a good feature on its own, and definitely something that should be viewed as a selling point of the game, it's hard to see it not being a direct dig at Final Fight's single-player limitation, which Sega knew about when designing the game due to the Super Famicom version of Final Fight releasing back in Christmas of 1990. I think regardless of Final Fight, Streets of Rage was always going to be a two-player title, just going back to Sega's other arcade ports, but it's something that has to be mentioned when discussing the history of the title. Along with not having the single-player limitation, Sega felt like it was important to have three very different characters to play as, which, again, shines the light on Final Fight only having two of the three available characters from the arcade, no matter which version you play. Also, I feel like Sega did a much better job in differentiating the playstyle in the characters of Axel, Adam, and Blaze versus Cody, Guy, and Hagar. While Cody and Guy have different animations and moves, they're both very similar in speed and damage, leaving Hagar as the brute of the bunch. Sega went a different route with Adam, Axel, and Blaze, having three characteristics for each character: speed, strength, and jumping ability. Each character excels in two of the three, leaving a weakness in one, which ends up making playing as each character a very different experience. The game itself proceeds the same no matter who you choose, which makes having different characters to choose from very important when it comes to replayability, as you have to really hone in on different strategies based on who you've chosen, especially in the harder difficulties. Just to give an example of this, I find it very difficult to use Axel in any of the games of the series due to his limited jumping ability. Certain enemies are much easier to target when using air attacks, and without those, you have to get a bit creative with how you take on the enemy. White men can't jump, indeed. Going back to the differences between Final Fight and Streets of Rage, combat in general is more complex, and considering that combat is 99% of the game, that's a big deal. Granted, it should be expected that combat would be more refined in Streets of Rage, seeing as how Final Fight originally debuted in the arcades in late 1989, but Sega could have taken the easy route and gone with simple button mashing. Thankfully though, they didn't, and gameplay in Streets of Rage is much deeper as a result. Rather than just the expected punches and jump kicks, each character has two throw variations, a throw and a suplex, team-up moves when playing in two-player mode, and the ability to catch yourself when thrown, which is huge for avoiding damage when fighting certain types of characters. Also, the concept of the special attack has changed between Streets of Rage and Final Fight. In Final Fight, if you hit both buttons at the same time, you'll do an area attack, useful for knocking back all of the enemies around you, at the expense of losing some health. Streets of Rage decided to do something different to expand combat, and if you hit both buttons, you'll perform a rear attack, which can be crucial to learn for certain bosses. Instead, for special attacks in Streets of Rage, you'll hit a dedicated button, and one of your friends that you still have on the police force will come in and launch either napalm or grenades, depending on if you're player 1 or player 2. You can only do this once per life, which leads to some strategy as to when to use them, but unlike Final Fight, you won't lose any health. One other area in which Sega tried to be unique with Streets of Rage is in regards to the story. The story in most beat-em-ups at the time was paper thin. Bad guys do bad things, good guys fight back, good guys save the day. And that's fine. However, with Streets of Rage, Sega threw a little wrinkle in towards the end of the game, and this next bit is a spoiler, so you might want to skip it. Once you make it to Mr. X, he gives you the choice of joining him. If you're dumb enough to go along with him, he tricks you and sends you back to level 6, and then you have to fight all the way back again to try to defeat him once and for all. And depending on how many lives and continues you have left, this might spell doom for your chances. But what if you're playing a two-player game, and one of you decides to go along with Mr. X and become a traitor to the other one? Well, then not only do you get a one-on-one fight, a la Billy and Jimmy Lee fighting over Marion and Double Dragon, but if the player that chose to side with Mr. X wins, then they will fight Mr. X normally, and if they win that fight, then that character achieves the game's bad ending, where they become the new leader of the Syndicate. Ultimately, this is a somewhat small detail that Sega added to the game, and it can be easily ignored, but I love the fact that they put the care into creating this Easter egg into the game to give players an additional challenge beyond just beating up bad guys. I've dedicated a good portion of this review so far to pointing out the differences between Final Fight and Streets of Rage, and so far Streets of Rage has come out clearly ahead. However, we've got to talk about the one place where Streets of Rage doesn't quite measure up, and that's the graphics. Now, before anyone starts to lose their mind, the graphics in Streets of Rage are not bad. And in fact, I think it's pretty amazing what Sega was able to do here with only 4 megabits. Especially when you take into effect the soundtrack, that I'll get to in a second. But when you compare the size of the sprites between the two games, Final Fight just feels more arcadish with huge characters, and the fact that each character has life bars, as opposed to just the bosses in Streets of Rage. Ultimately, I think it's a bit of a draw, as even though the characters in Streets of Rage are smaller, they have better animations, and the lack of characters on screen at a time in Final Fight becomes pretty obvious after a while. Finally, you can't talk about a Streets of Rage game and not talk about the soundtrack. If you're not aware, the intro music to each and every one of these reviews on the channel is the end level track from Streets of Rage, and the reason for that choice is because the music and sound effects in Streets of Rage is near perfect. Yuzo Koshiro, who previously was responsible for the equally great soundtrack in Revenge of Shinobi, delivered again here. Every background track is great and all fit the game perfectly while not sounding monotonous. You're never playing a level where, oh lovely, it's yet another upbeat techno track. Along with the fantastic soundtrack, the sound effects are equally as good. Every ding, crash, or thud is clear as a bell, and the screams from defeated characters are appropriately strident. One of the best things I can say about the soundtrack is that when it's played over modern stereo equipment, it still sounds just as good as it did 30 years ago. For one last comparison between the titles, the audio in Final Fight for the Super Nintendo is noticeably poor. Not only is it bad in comparison to the arcade version's fantastic soundtrack, but Yuzo just made them look silly here, and completely outclassed Capcom. For those that want to insist on comparing FM to PCM sound because they think the Super Nintendo is better, these are not two games that you want to compare. Streets of Rage, along with Revenge of Shinobi, were two games I'd played early on in the Genesis, and the greatness of both of them is what sold me on the platform. Had it not been for the existence of Streets of Rage, who knows, maybe I would have pushed for having a Super Nintendo instead, because while the port of Final Fight has issues, it's still Final Fight, and not to mention other admittedly great games that are in the Super Nintendo's library. And to be fully transparent, later on I did briefly own a Super Nintendo, but by then I was already a Sega guy, and I really just had it to play the AAA titles that I couldn't play on the Genesis. My point is when I said earlier that Streets of Rage changed my life, that wasn't a joke or hyperbole. It's really one of the games that shaped where I am today, and I certainly wouldn't be doing this channel or have this collection without it. As a result, I'm giving Streets of Rage on the Genesis 4 stars. This may surprise some of you in the fact that I didn't give it the full 5 stars, but let's just say that this is just the beginning of the Streets of Rage saga, and there's plenty of time for that mythical 5-star rating to pop up later.
Okay, that was Streets of Rage for the Genesis. To say I was excited to do this review is an understatement. Normally the day after I post a video, I take a break from all things channel related, just to relax and take it easy. Not so with Streets of Rage. Literally the night after I posted the last video for Space Harrier 2, I was back at it, playing Streets of Rage and recording the game footage seen in today's video. After all these years of playing this game, every single time I pull it out, I get joy from playing it, and it simply never gets old or feels like time has passed it by. Tune in next time for a look at yet another game that I've never played before, and in this case, that might be somewhat surprising as it's a game that's pretty famous to the early Genesis library, but maybe not so much in the United States, I suppose. It's from a sport that I haven't covered yet this year, but I think I'm going to have to start reviewing these types of games a little more often, as there is simply a lot of them once you start including the European Master System, Mega Drive, and even 32X libraries. I'm not exactly sure when that video is going to air yet, as I'll be going out of town to Jacksonville, Florida, and doing some retro hunting down there, but hopefully it'll be up by mid next week at the latest, and maybe I'll do a bonus video for what I find in Jacksonville too, for people that might be planning a trip to the area. Please think about subscribing if you're so inclined, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.